Hello, I'm Peter Sheppard Skaerved. I'm a violinist, and I'd like to talk a little bit about working with the past. On the 19th of September, I gave my first concert to a live audience since lockdown began in the spring. A pre-booked audience of 30 people came to the astonishing 1682 Christopher Wren Church of St Mary Abbot Church in London's Square Mile. I stood in front of a carved reredos made in 1686 by Grinling Gibbons, under a dome painting made in 1708 by William Snow. And I played a programme of works written in the 1600s, plus one new work by the Macedonian composer Mihailo Trantofilovsky. I used three instruments, one by Girolamo Amati from 1629, one by Jacob Raymond, made in 1641, and an anonymous violin made in Brescia, probably round about 1560. These instruments had a variety of setups and 4 different tunings. Around the music I wove texts from the 1600s by Anne Finch, Elizabeth Cavendish, Samuel Pepys, and Hook. At some point in this short hour of music, It seemed as if everyone in the room remembered why it is we do this. We remember the magic that can happen when we share music, art, and words in a space, and most importantly, together. And anything I'm going to say perhaps be heard in that context. There's not really any difference between the way that I play the music of our own time and the music of the past. I have an equally inconsistent approach to everything I play. This situation is compounded because I don't really have the ability to specialize. If that makes me a generalist, or perhaps even an interloper in the areas in which I'm active, then all I can say is that that is the method with which I am comfortable. Coming new to a composer, a piece of music, an instrument, even to a performing space, I ask, what would I like to do now? This results in a motley of approaches, ranging from the targeted, such as exploring the scordatura of the Klagenfurt manuscript on a small gut-strung 1685 Stradivarius, through to the eccentric, playing and recording the 1735 Telemann flute fantasies on a 1570 Andrea Amati with a tiny late 17th century bow. I'd like to offer some ideas from my practice in the hope that they might be interesting. I'm fascinated by the exchanges involved in the making of music, particularly how ideas are shared between composer and performer. Of course, this must always be explored with the proviso that at any given time or locale, the performer is or is not the or a composer, or that the composer is or is not a or the performer. This interlocks fascinatingly in every period with the question of whether or not the composer is writing for themselves or for others. And if they are writing for others, whether it's for a specific well-known artistic collaborator or for a large group, such as a musically active or music purchasing public. Much of my time is spent in the very smallest scale of string playing, completely alone. So I hope I can be forgiven if I make observations from that standpoint. I will begin with two images which feel a little bit like one. The first edition, from 1684, of John Playford's The Division Violin has a lovely engraving on the title page. A musician sits on a high-backed oak and leather chair at a table which may or not be covered. He's playing the violin. The table itself has been graffitied with Division Violin above the open volume laid on its top. It seems that we are to understand that the contented smile which plays across our violinist's face is due to his enjoyment of that music as he plays it. I'm sure it is, actually. Musical instruments, a bass viol or a cello, with a bow and a crossed pair of crudely represented wind instruments, hang on the wall. Light floods the room from the double bay leaded windows in the centre. One thing is clear above all: a musician is at home. It's not clear whether there's an audience, and that question might be moot, is our fiddler is smiling at the artist, or at us, at me, at you. Every night I set up my workspace in my apartment here near the River Thames in East London. I make a pot of verbena tea, get out whichever instrument I'm going to play, and put my music flat on my work table under a daylight reading lamp. I have a good work chair, a trip trap, and always sit to practice. I never use a music stand. Of course, I have a number of tools not represented on Playford's title page. I have pencils, pens, and the all-important practice mute. But I sit under very large leaded workshop windows, like his, and in the summer, conversation and the occasional clink of glassware can be heard from the walkways of the Victorian building opposite, where my neighbours like to sit and talk. They can see me, but even if my windows are open, which they always are, they can't hear me. That's the benefits of the hotel mute. This is how the majority of my music is made. I offer this simple comparison between musicians in the 17th and 21st centuries to point out how so much of our personal practice, and I use that word in the sense that a visual artist uses it, is similar to that of our forebears who sit in the same space as we sit now. I can't see, hear, or feel this as being in the past, which is perhaps a shortcoming. As I said, I live in the old docks of London, Wapping, on a curiously dog-legged street, which appears just so in Morgan's map of the whole of London, 1682. I know that there were string instruments here in the late 1600s, because Samuel Pepys tells me so. By and by, down by water on several ships, and stood upon a stage in one place seeing caulker's sheathing of a ship. Then at Wapping, that's where I'm sitting right now, to my carvers about my vial head. So home and thence to my vial makers in Bishopsgate Street. His name is Wise, who is a pretty fellow about it. 4 days later, Samuel Pepys met a plain fiddler like me at his brother Tom's barber's shop, and had my hair cut while his boy played on the violin. A plain boy, but hath a very good genius, and understands the book very well. This plain boy is not only playing from music, but doing it very well, and it provided a relief from the endless gossip, no doubt, of hairdressers then as now. Now there's a tension between the musical expectations of the 17th and 21st centuries, and it arises from the perhaps temporary moment, I hope, when the majority of people's experience of music became not only non-performing, but, in our time, mediated through various forms of reproduction. This led to the rather illogical perception, which any music teacher will recognize with a sigh, that all too often the practice of music was practicing for another event. This, for many young people across the world, has been confined to graded musical exams, which offer an even more bizarre form of listening. This is changing. COVID-19 has accelerated the change. At this moment in lockdown, the majority of music making is happening in the home, from families playing together in the happily broadest sense, through to the great multi-instrumentalist Kapellmeister of our time, gladly back in his hideaway, Jacob Collier. And we can see it all. Today, in the most in-public music making is in the private sphere, thanks to the internet. I think that the musicians and listeners of the age of Afraben and Nicola Matthäus and Nicholas Hawksmoor, that's the 16 and early 1700s, would identify with such immediacies. My home-driven music making informs or misinforms my approach to everything I play. Every time I gingerly begin exploring a project, and this, of course, stretches from the smallest work to a large cycle of pieces, I find my way in, violin at hand, at my table, just like Playford's violinist. I cannot say what elements will find their way into the explorations as a project develops, but the majority of my musicking, if I may, happens in that environment, this environment, and my attempts to understand are the result of the highly, for me, enjoyable activity that happens every night. Some of the most moving moments with music happen at the desk, and some of them happen when an audience or a space shows us the way. So here are 3 moments which illustrate a little of what I'm talking about. The first took place 4 years ago, when I first received the copy of an astonishing 1685 manuscript, the Klagenfurt manuscript. I must stress that my work on this source is not scholarly. For the real work on this material, the real understanding, I urge you to seek out the research that Pauline Nobes has done as a distinguished violinist and scholar. But my facsimile arrived electronically from the very helpful team at Klagenfurt's Landesmuseum für Kerpen. I waited impatiently while my printer spooled out the 100+ sheets. Then to my desk, to my violin, to the practice mute, and the tuning fork, as I began to puzzle out the 7 or 8 scudature, that's the different tunings used in the piece. I'm not sure quite how much audible music making happened during those first hours, nor at what point what happened. I can say the beginning was not a comfortable process. Anyone who plays a lot of scordatura will know, particularly on a violin and with the high string tensions, that there's a lot of a sense of Jacob the Angel as we wrestle towards tunings, bridge placements, hand settings, which work whilst trying to find an instrument which does not shift and warp and adjust too much under the various settings. But this is merely prologue. unless things do not go well, to the moment when quite suddenly all comes clear and plain sailing follows. In my case, this moment came about 24 movements into the cycle. Suddenly I realized that what I was playing, what I was practicing, was an absolute beauty, that these are pieces that I will perform and explore for the rest of my life. I put the violin down and went to the other room in the apartment where my wife, who's a writer, was working. There was almost nothing I could say. I needed her to know that I was speechless. This was a moment when it became necessary to go beyond me, the desk, the violin, the music, and try and describe my wonder. This, of course, is what drives our need to perform, our yearning to share what we find. Underpinning this moment of clarity was an awareness that I was working with a source designed to be used in the way I was using it. Clearly from the layout of pages, recto and verso, the writer had laid the music out so that there would not be any page turns. This might sound a little crude, but it told me that the violinist composer of the material expected to be alone when they played it, not to have someone turning pages for them. This made sense. As I suspect, this score was written by and to be played by a nun at the convent where the volume was discovered, in what is now modern-day Slovenia. Of course, this is the opposite of Bach's sonatas and partitas, which, whilst they were very likely written for Bach's own use, are inscribed with volti subito, volti presto, go on quickly, turn the page quickly, at the page turns in the middle of long movements. I'm not really sure that Bach, both with regards to his family and professional situations, was ever really alone. So there was always someone to turn the pages, presto, be it family member or fellow musician. The next trivial insight, which can come from the score designed by and for a solitary musician, being the composer, is the interweave between composing and performer. I notice that the composer-performer often does not distinguish between these activities. At a number of points in the Klagenfurt source, I see the creator's pen run away with itself. Improvisation and invention win out over form and discipline. At the end of one lovely set of divisions of variations, our composer forgets the four-bar structure and just noodles on like the winding tail end of a Danish hymn tune. Playing this, I've actually heard audiences laugh out loud at this moment. It's not unusual, and it's not a mistake. What I find really charming is observing a composer deciding whether or not to correct their accidents. In both this case and another score that I love dearly, Giuseppe Tartini's Piccole Sonate, I watch, or rather I play, as the composer realizes their errors and crosses out furiously. In Tartini's case, he forgets the number of beats in a set of couplets. I need to remind myself, us, that what we're doing as artists is delving into what happens. This is something which I've learned talking with composers. Working with the great British composer Sir Michael Tippett, I discovered that this musical omnivore was interested in what happened while his music was played, and if his music was played twice, his question, always with a mischievous grin, was, what happens next? Now, there are plenty of composers who want exactly what they have written, whatever that means. And there are points between these two approaches. But I think it's important to work out how much we are duty-bound to interfere or not interfere with the material. And going back to Playford's violinist at the table, what is it that we do when we are by ourselves? Just instrument, music, room, player. Working on Tartini's 6-hour cycle of piccole sonatas that I just mentioned means it's impossible for me to avoid taking authority over material. Let me explain. By the end of this huge manuscript, This composer's propensity for musical shorthand means that we have to make daring choices, or there is no music. The last sonata of the set, contained in full on page 106 of the manuscript, consists of 8 movements. Some of these are fully written out. One requests the repetition of a movement from earlier in the cycle. One demands the minorization, that's putting it into the minor, of a major movement from earlier on. And one consists of 4 bars in 3/4, and then etc., no more music. This was a moment where my practice desk, if you like, failed me. I did not simply want to make up the remainder of the piece. It wouldn't have been difficult, but I knew that I could not offer a satisfactory solution, although I completely accepted that this shorthand was all that Tartini needed to play. He, after all, was Tartini. I am not. I momentarily gave up, as there were 105 more pages of music that I was worrying about, and I stepped away from the problem. A few days later, walking along Lower Thames Street, that's near the river near here, I found myself under another Christopher Wren tower of the Church of St. Magnus the Martyr. I stood silent for a moment, as ever astonished at the invention and creative solutions that Wren and his collaborators always found for architectural problems of space and light. Suddenly, looking at this building, an answer to the Tartini problem came to me. The melodic material, that is, the pitches, of the first 2 bars of this unfinished minuet was the same, exactly the same notes, as those which filled the first 2 bars of the preceding movement, an aria cantabile, in 4 beats in a bar. And these occupy the first half of the very same line of music on this page 106. Surely it couldn't be that simple. Leaning over the wall by the River Thames, I unrolled the rest of this 4/4 material in my head, but putting it into 3/4. That 10-bar aria suddenly became an 18-bar minuet. I ran home, grabbed a sheet of manuscript paper, and wrote it out. I fully accept that Tartini had put me in this position because he was writing his music for himself, not for me. As we all know, personalized scores become mnemonics. That's a way of remembering things. That's the musical equivalent of a knotted handkerchief. Though I've forgotten when I last heard of that memory trick being used. I know that my maternal grandfather did it. In the 20th century, the increasing separation between the roles composer and performer play led to hybrid versions of such reminders. The score for Nam June Paik's infamous solo for violin, which I performed only once and will only perform once, is just one. I saw it in an exhibition in Mexico City where I was playing the piece. It consists of a musical staves on which is scrawled around a rough sketch of a violin, quote, "Please ask Ben Patterson how to play it." It did amuse me that the score, which results in a smashing of a violin, Paik's score, helped me with my speculative reconstruction of Tartini's Note to Self. I'm the first person to admit that the conclusions or insights that I come to are very likely wrong, and are at best provisional, serving what I'm doing at any time as a performer. Indeed, one of the most fascinating aspects of all notation, be it the nothing there simplicity of one of the enormous Giuseppe Colombi toccatas for solo violin from the 17th century, or the amazing precision of Marin Marais' notation for bass viol a few years later, is that there seems to be the same degree of freedom and latitude offered by each technique, the laissez-faire aptitude of Colombi or the high detail of Marais. The experience of working with living composers teaches us that very often the same contradiction can be observed. Composers who notate the least often demand the greatest timbral and expressive exactitude, whether it is written down or not, and vice versa. This brings me to my third example, to instruments. For the whole of my playing life, I've been involved with violin and bow makers, restorers, and the exploration of old and new instrumental designs and technologies. Unlike some violinists, I've never fallen in love with a particular instrument. My sense has always been that every violin or viola has something to offer, whether it is new, old, in converted state, gut strings or wire, even good or bad. There's no such thing as a violin or bow without its own unique voice that can teach us something. And once I've learned to sing with that voice, its elements can be transported, transposed to another instrument. Last year, I gave a concert of 17th century solo works at the Metropolitan Museum in New York City on Cremonese violins from their collection. I alternated between two Antonio Stradivari violins from the mid-1690s, the Francesca and the Gould. One of these is in modern setup. The other was restored to Baroque neck, bridge and bass bar, etc. in the 1970s. It remains the only Stradivarius violin which has been restored thus. At the start of this concert, I did not tell the audience which fiddle I was playing on, and began with a Johann Joseph Wilsmeyer Partia on the modern Strat, albeit with scordatura, and with the Baroque, the Biber bow, by the bowmaker Antonino Arlenti of Genova. I noticed that not only was it difficult for the listeners to discriminate between the setups as I went through the concert, but that increasingly it also was for me. The timbres and colours of one instrument were travelling to the other. This situation offered a contained model of something I have often experienced. Here's an example. I spent 5 years performing on the long pattern Joachim Stradivari of 1698. This gave me an insight into a particular range of tone colours, many of them darker, huskier than I'd explored before. I stopped using the Joachim violin regularly in 2013, but the material it gave me, to my hands, to my ears and imagination, is still with me, and I can take it to other violins, other setups. Instruments teach us about music. Music teaches us about instruments. This intersect is usefully troubling, as everyone has a different point of view as to what could be learned. A simple, rather crude story might illustrate what might be gained from spending time with a string instrument of any age. A few years ago, I had the rare opportunity to work and record on a beautiful Giovanni Paolo Magini violin. Unlike many of this Brescian master's instruments, this violin had not been cut down. It was what we violinists like to call a monster. It was a really fantastic instrument to play, to hold, and to look at. All of these are important. As usual, I was practicing late at night, probably around 3 a.m., and the only light in my room was the reading lamp over my work table. All of a sudden, as I drew the bow across the strings of the Magini, my nose and my mouth and eyes filled with the acrid, stinging smell and taste of soot. The instrument had not been played much in recent years, and clearly my protracted practice sessions had dislodged something inside its box. The legacy of centuries of wood smoke. I was stunned. It had never occurred to me before that for most of its life, this instrument was played around naked flames, from the hearth, from the kitchen range, to the candles on a music stand or chandeliers. These days, we do our best to keep string instruments as far from fire as possible. A wonderful Cremonese instrument on which I had the privilege to perform and record was destroyed recently in a house fire in the US earlier this year. I found that extremely shocking. There's a sort of violin-shaped hole where that instrument used to be. The sensation and stink, which briefly emanated from this beautiful Magini, however, reminds me of the osmosis that happens constantly between players and instruments, and between instrument and composition and composer. We cannot be sure whether the insight that we find or offer will be prosaic or profound. transforming, or banal. All that I can say is that it is vital that we allow it to happen.